Resident Evil Extinction, a novelization by Keith R.A. DeCandido, based on the screenplay by Paul W.S. Anderson, based on Capcom's best-selling video games. The subtitle caption reads, "All Bets Are Off." Dedicated to the fond memory of Pierce Askegryn, 1955 to 2006, he would have really loved this. Part 1. Before and After. 1. Before. Dr. Jim Nabel stood on the Ravensgate Bridge with a seething tide of humanity heading straight for him. Nabel was grateful for the presence of the Umbrella Corporation security guards and members of the Raccoon City Police Department, who were stemming that particular tide, keeping him from being overrun. Nabel and a small medical station had been placed at the wall that had been hastily constructed around Raccoon City. The island metropolis had been completely enclosed by that wall, with the only opening at this bridge, the major artery in and out of Raccoon. The outbreak of a virus that didn't just kill you but animated your corpse and gave it an instinctive need to feed on human flesh, thus transmitting the disease to more and more people, brought a fierce desire on the part of the surviving citizens to leave the city as fast as they could. But the risk of infection was quite high, so the Umbrella Corporation, the pharmaceuticals and electronics firm that paid Nabel's obscenely high salary, physically quarantined the city and would allow only those who were uncontaminated to leave. That morning, when the outbreak was first announced, Nabel had been given the specifics of the virus and told to develop a quick test that would determine if the virus was in a sample of human blood. Nabel had pioneered many streamlinings of standard blood tests, the patents for which would guarantee him a comfortable retirement. But Nabel was only in his late 20s, and he still wanted to practice. Umbrella, having purchased the rights to use his procedure for their medical divisions, which provided services to hospitals around the world, hired him to do just that. The rumor around the lab was that Umbrella had actually developed this virus, though Nabel didn't really credit rumors. It wasn't as if samples of tainted blood were hard to come by right now. Some of those rumors were that the virus had wiped out the hive, killing all 500 people who worked in that underground complex. Nabel had a few friends down in the hive, and he hadn't actually heard from any of them since yesterday. But then he often went days without hearing from them. However, that wasn't Nabel's primary concern. He'd spent the better part of the day taking blood from people and running the quick test, with only one food break, and then only because he was on the verge of collapse. Major Kane had been willing to let him take more breaks, but with so many people piling into the bridge, wanting to leave and unable to do so without Nabel's express okay, the doctor couldn't bring himself to keep them waiting. By the time darkness fell, he could barely stay upright. Sleep was building up in his eyes, and he tried to rub them, only to wince from the oily feel of the rubber glove on his eyelids. The crowds had just grown larger with the onset of night. Nabel had long since lost track of how many quick tests he'd done. Whenever he was in danger of running out of anything, test tubes, gas for the Bunsen burner, rubber gloves, or the solvent he had developed, some black-suited person from security division showed up with a fresh supply before Nabel even had the chance to ask. At some point, he'd cut his finger. He'd barely acknowledged the trickle of blood that had been smeared as he removed the rubber glove. Then a security goon handed him a Band-Aid. "Thanks," he said with a ragged smile as he applied the Band-Aid. He wasn't too worried about any infection. That was why he wore the gloves after all. It would have been nice if he remembered how he actually got the cut. But that was a concern for another time when he wasn't in an emergency situation and exhausted beyond all reason. Shaking the third of 3 test tubes over the burner, one each from a mother, a father, and child, who'd come together, and seeing that they all came up green, Nabel said, "They're clean. Let them pass." So far, none of the blood had turned blue. The error margin for the test was that it often gave false positives, but never false negatives. It might be inaccurate insofar as it would say someone clean had the virus, but it wouldn't say that someone who was infected didn't have it. As long as the blood turned green in the test tube when heated with Nabel's solvent, the person was definitely free of the virus. Nabel would stake his reputation on it, and his reputation was considerable. An old man and a young woman came up next. Even as Nabel was drawing blood from the woman, the old man suddenly collapsed. Panic shot through Nabel. He stood up straight for the first time in about 4 hours. If this old guy was infected... "Oh my God, Daddy!" The teenager fell to her knees and started unbuttoning the old man's shirt. "He's not breathing. It's his heart. He has a weak heart." A heart attack wasn't what Nabel was worried about. People who were infected with this virus could easily just collapse out of nowhere. The old man didn't have any visible bites, but Nabel couldn't see his entire body either. The girl started to give her father mouth-to-mouth, which wasn't quite the stupidest thing she could have done, but was right up there. "Get away from him," Nabel cried. He was about to move to yank her off and found that he couldn't. She was trying to save her father's life, after all. Nabel took his Hippocratic oath very seriously, even if he couldn't really remember all of it most of the time, and he couldn't just stop someone from engaging in a life-saving procedure. But he could get someone else to do it. Looking up, he saw that Sergeant Wells of the RCPD was nearby, along with an armed woman wearing a tube top and a miniskirt. Nabel presumed she was an off-duty cop pressed into service. To Wells, Nabel spoke in his best order nurses around voice, "Get her away from him." With a grunt, the sergeant did as he was told, though the girl didn't make it easy on him. "No, let me go," she cried. "He's saving your life," Nabel muttered as he removed the test tube from the needle. He had a very bad feeling about what the quick test was going to show. Before he even had a chance to add the solvent, the old man's eyes opened. They were milky white. Nabel didn't need to run the test to know that the blood he had in the test tube was going to turn up blue. The old man was infected. As if to prove it, he immediately bit Sergeant Wells's leg, which meant the cop was going to turn into an animated corpse before too long as well. Before anybody else could react, the woman in the tube top shot the old man right in the head, while the girl was screaming that the woman had killed her daddy. Nabel felt a hand grab his arm. It was Anderson, the head of security detail down here. "We're out of here, Doc," he said, guiding Nabel rather forcibly toward the gate. "Wait a minute, you can't," Nabel started, even as he was all but dragged toward the gate. He couldn't just leave these people. He'd been there all day, and... "Giddings," Anderson said to the Bluetooth in his ear, "we've got an infected man here. I'm evacing the doc." He then nodded in response to whatever Giddings might have said. Anderson all but threw Nabel through the gate, forcing the doctor to stumble to the ground. Only then did he realize he was still holding the test tube with the old man's blood, which he mostly noticed when it shattered on the pavement of the bridge. Clambering to his feet, Nabel looked down at the shards of test tube and infected blood, the latter spreading in rivulets through the asphalt. "Perfect ending to a perfect day," he muttered. Another security goon, a woman whose name patch read Zoll, led him toward a helicopter that was waiting on the far side of the bridge. Halfway there, he heard a thunderous bang that made him almost jump out of his shoes. Whirling around, he saw that the gate had been closed. "They can't just trap those people there." "Not my call, sir," Zoll said. "We have to go." As they approached the helicopter, Nabel heard Kane's voice over a loudspeaker. "This is a biohazard quarantine area." Nabel shuddered. He supposed that Kane was right. If one infected person had made it to the bridge, dozens more could have, and in that crowd it would spread like a brush fire. Kane repeated, "This is a biohazard quarantine area. Due to risk of infection, you cannot be allowed to leave the city. All appropriate measures are being taken. The situation is under control. Please return to your homes. With a snort, Nabel said, Fat chance of that. He's never going to get those people to move off the bridge. As Zoll offered him a hand up into the helicopter, she smiled and said, I think the Major will convince them, Doctor. Nabel sighed as he entered the helicopter. The main section had benches along both side walls, or bulkheads, or whatever they called them, which were mostly filled with fellow Umbrella employees and black-clad, well-armed Security Division folks. Glancing around, Nabel finally found a spare space between someone he didn't recognize, who, like him, wore a lab coat, and someone from security. As soon as he squeezed in between them, Zoll closed the hatch, and Nabel felt a pull on his stomach as the helicopter took off. He shook his head, wishing he could have done more, but he wasn't about to resist someone with a gun telling him to get into a helicopter, especially since that gun wielder was carrying out the wishes of the people who signed his paycheck. He just hoped that some of the people on this helicopter, or the others that had been used to evacuate people in the science and medical divisions, were working on a cure. Lifting his arm to scratch an itch on his nose, Nabel was surprised to see that the Band-Aid he'd hastily put on his right index finger had fallen off at some point. The cut was red with blood, but it didn't seem to be actually bleeding anymore. Looking around, he asked, Anyone have a Band-Aid? Chapter 2. After. The cameras recorded everything. At present, they showed a large, beautifully appointed bathroom. It was all brass and marble, and the place was as large as some big city studio apartments. The shower, which was running, its staccato rhythm the only noise coming from the room, was a larger-than-average stall, with only a small lip and a shower curtain to keep the water contained. The curtain had been ripped from the rod and was draped over the shower's sole occupant, a naked woman. She was unconscious or asleep. Her chest expanded and contracted slowly with each breath, the only sign of life she gave. Then her blue eyes opened. Slowly, she got to her feet. She looked very disoriented. The cameras followed her movements as she turned the shower off and padded out into the bathroom proper. With one hand, she wiped the condensation from the mirror to take a look at herself. She gave the bruise on her right shoulder only a cursory glance. She seemed much more interested in what looked like a severe and long-healed knife wound on her left shoulder, as if she didn't know how she got it. She looked around, but if the bathroom had any wisdom to grant her, she was unable to glean it. So she walked out the door into a large bedroom. The cameras in that room winked into life and followed her. The centerpiece of the bedroom was a huge double bed with 2 sets of pillows. Laid out on the center of the bed were a red dress, a pair of panties, and a pair of biker shorts. After staring at the clothing for several seconds, she put on the panties and the biker shorts and shrugged into the dress. A pair of thigh-high boots sat at the foot of the bed, and she slid them on. Everything seemed to fit perfectly. She looked at her left hand, noticed the gold wedding band on it. As with everything else, she seemed confused by it. Wandering over to the window, she pushed back the thick curtains with the odd patterns on them to reveal a concrete wall. This, more than anything, seemed to baffle her. Why would anyone put a set of curtains over a concrete wall? Of course, the wall didn't match the rest of the decor. Perhaps that was the reason for the curtains. The bedroom's furnishings also included a beautiful wooden writing desk right next to the window. A pad of paper sat at the center of it, and someone had written, "Today, all your dreams come true," and then underlined it with an X in the center of the underline. She grabbed the ornately designed pen next to the pad and started writing beneath the underline. She got as far as, "Today, all your," then stopped when it became obvious that it wasn't she who had written it. Frustrated, she moved out into the next room, the dining hall. Though there was no dining table, it was simply a large empty room with a few antique chairs and end tables, wood paneling, and a lot of space. One of those end tables had a framed picture atop it. She picked it up, seeing her own face along with that of a handsome man. He wore a tuxedo, she a bridal gown. Again, she stared down at the gold band on her left ring finger. A heavy thud startled her. She set the picture down and turned toward a statue that was just past the far end of the room, in a vestibule. The statue was, for reasons passing understanding, wrapped loosely in plastic. A breeze ruffled the plastic, making a low, crackling noise. "Hello?" Curious, she set the picture down and walked toward the statue, stepping through the entryway into the vestibule. She found a large, ornate wooden door. It had a brass pull handle that was at neck level for some reason. Reaching up, she pulled the handle downward, and the door swung open. On the other side was a long, thin corridor with walls of glass that led to a giant metal door that looked as if it belonged in a bank vault. Bright lights behind the glass walls came on as she entered, and she averted her eyes from the sudden illumination. Slowly, carefully, she walked forward, blinking a few times to adjust her eyes. Once she was halfway there, the lights dimmed again. She looked around quickly, not sure what was happening, but getting into a defensive crouch, trying to be ready for what might come. What came was a horizontal beam of light at about ankle height that sprang into being right in front of the metal door at the far end. Then it started to move toward her. She got lower in her crouch, preparing to jump, when the beam moved up to chest height. Seemingly running on instinct, she backpedaled and took a quick glance behind her to see that the big wooden door had slammed shut as well. Crouching low, she leapt up toward the ceiling, wrapping her fingers around an air vent, and levered her legs upward so that her body was parallel to the floor, above the line of the laser. As long as the laser didn't rise any higher, she'd be fine. The red dress she wore was cut oddly. It extended to her ankle on the outer part of her right leg, but was cut in a U shape, leaving her legs free. On the left side, the dress came only to her hips. The bit on her right side hung down loosely from her position atop the glass corridor, extending below the laser line. The laser sliced cleanly through the fabric, the cloth fluttering noiselessly to the floor, smoke coming off the charred end of the part that was still attached. Lowering herself back to a vertical position, she let go of the air vent and landed on the floor, bending her knees to lessen the impact. Before she could decide on another course of action, the lights dimmed again, and another beam formed at ankle height at the far end. This time, though, the beam didn't rise to chest height. Instead, it spread into a diagonal grid that took up the entire breadth and height of the corridor. Nowhere to jump, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, with one exception. Again, she jumped to the ceiling. Again, she grabbed the air vent, but this time she didn't just level off, but kicked upward at one of the other air vents, knocking it askew, using her ankles to brace herself. She slid into the vent, barely ahead of the laser grid. Her head went in last, blonde hair sliced at the ends and vaporized by the grid before it could reach the floor. The air vent was tight, and she took a moment to get her bearings and squiggle around into a position where she could crawl through. Her only illumination came from the glass corridor below, and that was obviously not an option, unless she wanted to be diced. So she crawled forward. The cameras followed her here too, transmitting in infrared, the heat source being the woman in the red dress. She crawled. Time was lost in the imperative of moving forward. All that mattered was finding a way out that didn't require staying in that glass corridor. She was moving in a direction that would put her back over the mansion. Perhaps she would get back in there. The cameras found another heat source, a flicker of light that now came into her field of vision. She crawled faster. The light grew brighter, but it was also in the top of the air duct, which meant it wouldn't lead to the mansion. But any port in a storm. She crawled to it, found another air vent much like the one she'd kicked in to get it here, and lifted it slowly, just enough for her to see where it led. It was a dark corridor, one not made of glass, which put it one up on the corridor she'd just left. Throwing the vent aside with a loud clank of metal on linoleum, she climbed up into the corridor. While not as sterile as the glass corridor, it wasn't as homey as the mansion either. Disinfectant tinged the air, which, along with the empty gurneys against one of the walls, identified this as a hospital, albeit an abandoned one. The only decorations were a few paintings that were probably meant to be soothing on the walls and the hexagonal red and white logo of the Umbrella Corporation on the floor. Slowly she walked forward, even more cautious after her last long corridor. At the end of this corridor was not a forbidding hunk of metal, but rather a set of glass doors. She could see the streets of Raccoon City beyond them. Walking past the gurney, she suddenly stopped, looked around as if sensing something wrong. After looking up and down the corridor for several seconds, she grabbed the gurney and rolled it down the corridor. Once the gurney made it to a fork in the corridor, a tripwire appeared and sliced the gurney clean in half. It would have done the same to her. Shaking her head, she continued forward, carefully stepping around the spot that the gurney ran over to set off the tripwire. And then she was thrown back several feet by a mine exploding. She landed in a heap against one wall of the corridor, staring down in shock at the gaping, bleeding hole in her chest. As the woman breathed her last, Dr. Samuel Isaacs cursed. Isaacs never used to curse. He had always prided himself on a fine vocabulary and a lack of need to resort to such crudity. But the world had changed over the past few years, and Isaacs had been forced to change with it. Among other things, this meant that when things went wrong, he no longer shook his head, clucked softly, and said something bland like, "What a pity," or "Back to the drawing board," or "Oh dear." No, he pounded a gloved fist on the table in front of him and said, "Shit." Then he turned to his team, who all like him were wearing white hazmat suits, and said, "Let's move." Yet another clone of Alice Abernathy had failed to make her way through the Cretan labyrinth. The other technicians and scientists went ahead in. Isaacs paused to close and seal the faceplate of the suit. The Cretan labyrinth nickname had come a few months back from Moody, one of the techs, and it had stuck. Timpson had suggested that they try to recreate Nemesis and use him as the Minotaur, an offense for which Isaacs might have fired Timpson under other circumstances. The Nemesis project had been Isaac's greatest success and greatest failure at the same time. He hated the very mention of it. Once Isaac's suit was properly sealed, he went in after Moody, Timpson, and the others. He hated wearing the damn suit, as it was impossible to breathe properly in the thing. In the old days, he'd have delegated. Sadly, the growing unpleasantness had reduced the staff to the point that Isaacs had to be much more hands-on than a supervisor of his experience usually was. Another change that had come in this new world they all lived in. Not for the first time, Isaacs cursed the name of Timothy Kane, a German immigrant who served in the U.S. Army before joining the Umbrella Corporation. Kane was single-handedly responsible for destroying the world. Worse, he was already dead, so he couldn't be punished. He died in Raccoon City shortly before it was vaporized by a tactical nuclear missile strike that Kane himself had ordered. There was blame to spread elsewhere, of course. Based on the surveillance they had been able to pull from the mansion attached to the hive, the very same one that had been partially recreated in the Cretan labyrinth. A former Umbrella security staffer, Percival Spencer Parks, had been the one to unleash the T-virus in the hive, condemning 500 people to death. After that, the hive had been sealed, the only survivors being Alice Abernathy and Matthew Addison, who had been brought into the Nemesis project. Had the hive remained sealed and been filled with concrete, it all would have been over. In fact, that had been Isaac's very recommendation to Kane. As with most recommendations from anyone other than himself, Kane ignored it, which was a pity, as Isaacs then would have been able to develop Nemesis properly, and no one would have found out about what happened in the hive. True, the families and friends of 500 people would have to have been told something, but they all lived in an underground complex that was filled with attendant risks. Surely Umbrella could have found a cover story. Instead, Kane reopened the hive, supposedly because he wanted to know what had happened. If the human race survived, Isaacs was quite sure that Kane's decision would go down in history as humanity's greatest blunder, surpassing such classics as Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the introduction of the rabbit into the Australian ecosystem. The infected corpses of the 500 hive employees, not to mention an entire security division team, had been animated by the T-virus, and Kane's reopening of the hive allowed them access to the world outside. Within 14 hours, Raccoon City was overrun. Each corpse was filled with an uncontrollable urge to feed on flesh. And when they did, their victims died and became hungry animated corpses themselves. Umbrella sealed off the city, just as it had been sealed off the hive, and then blew it up with a nuke. That was only a temporary stopgap. Isaacs looked down at the corpse. The dead blue eyes stared straight ahead. Blood pooled beneath the body from the gaping hole in its thoracic region. He shook his head. Take a sample of her blood, then get rid of that. Turning around, he went back into the lab. He had to get out of the damn suit. Andy Timpson watched as Isaacs retreated to the safety of the observation room. Wuss, he muttered under his breath. Go ahead, Brendan Moody said next to him. Say that louder, I double dog dare you. Aren't you supposed to build up to that? Andy asked Brendan as the latter reached into the sterilized pouch on his suit and took out a syringe attached to a test tube. Huh? Brendan asked distractedly as he put the point of the syringe into the pool of blood under Alice 85's body. You start with the dare, Andy said. Then it's double dare. Then it's double dog dare, he frowned. I think. Been a while since I saw the movie. Oh, that's from a movie? Christ, Brendan, did you have no childhood? Standing over them, the lone member of security assigned to the group, Paul DeGennaro, said, Is there a chance that you two will ever shut the fuck up? Not a big chance, no, Andy said with a cheeky grin that Paul couldn't actually see through the visor. Not that Paul needed to see it, since he knew it was there, and he probably shared it. Figured I'd ask, maybe the 900th time be the charm. Brendan stood up, removing the test tube from the syringe. We're all rooting for number 901, Paul. Trust me. In the old days, Andy and Brendan never would have dreamed of bantering with the thug squad. They were the big, obnoxious apes who shot people and used words of one syllable. Andy and Brendan were the dumb geeks who couldn't find their butts with both hands. Neither side had any use for the other. But that was the old days. These days, you couldn't afford not to get along with the people you worked with, because those were the people you lived with every day, probably for the rest of your life. Generally, Andy tried not to think about it. Brendan held up the test tube. I'm going to go run this through the machines and see what wisdom it provides. Probably the same thing the last 84 tests said. Yeah, you want to tell Isaacs that? You can do it right after you call him a wuss to his face. Before Andy could respond to Brendan's dig, Paul said, Come on, Timpson, let's haul. I don't want to spend any more time outside than I have to. Sobering, Andy said, Yeah, you want the feet this time? Nah, I'll take the shoulders. Wouldn't want you to get blood on your precious hazmat suit. Hey, at least this one got past the lasers, Andy shuddered, remembering the early clone who got sliced and diced by the laser grid. Andy couldn't eat steak for a week after that. Not that there was a whole hell of a lot of steak to be had these days. Umbrella had an impressive stockpile of food to keep its few remaining employees nourished, but guys like Andy and Paul usually didn't get the good stuff. Spam on rye was a typical lunch at the technician and security grunt level. But at least they were getting food. That was all the payment they received, but it beat the hell out of the alternative. Andy bent over and grabbed Alice 85's ankles, then waited for Paul to get a grip on her shoulders before straightening. He said, "Besides, I know the real reason you get queasy walking backwards." "Hardy har har." Paul lifted her by the shoulders. "This one feels lighter." Andy started backpedaling down the corridor toward the glass doors. Half her chest was blown off. It's a great dieting program. "Got her tits, too." Paul's leer wasn't visible, but Andy could practically hear it. "Probably lose a lot of weight there." "Not with her tits," Andy said with a chuckle. "Dolly Parton, she ain't." "Yeah, I know. I trained with the real one. Remember? Still, there's fat there, right?" "Yeah." The two of them made it to the doors, which opened at their approach. The city view remained visible on the glass even as they parted. Behind them was the metal platform in the tube that led to the surface. As Andy backed onto the platform, he shuddered, the same way he always did when they went topside. Once they were in, Paul stepped on a big red button on the floor, resulting in the pneumatic hiss of the hydraulics that lifted the platform up out of the underground complex that had become home and work and refuge for Andy, Paul, Brendan, Dr. Isaacs, and a few dozen other employees of the Umbrella Corporation who had survived the apocalypse. When he was a kid, Andy's mother had told him about what life was like in the 1950s during the early days of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. How they'd have drills to practice what to do in case of a nuclear attack. These drills supposedly involved curling up under one's school desk, which left his mother with the impression until she was 18 that wood was proof against nuclear fallout. For so long, people assumed that when the world ended, it would be because someone dropped the bomb. Half the science fiction stories that Andy had read or watched on television as a kid predicted a post-apocalyptic future where some superpower or other dropped a bomb on their enemies, leaving only a few humans to keep the planet going. As the hydraulic lift brought Andy, Paul, and the corpse of Alice 85 to the surface of Death Valley, Andy wondered if they would have been better off with bombs instead of this. And it didn't just figure that Umbrella's super-secret underground base was located in Death Valley. With a creaking sound, hidden doors parted in the floor of the weather station above to allow the platform to come to a halt on a level with the weather station's floor. Located in the heart of the Death Valley salt flats, the station was built around the same time that Andy's mother had been hiding under her desk to stay safe from the bomb, and it hadn't been upgraded in almost that long. A tube filled with mercury indicated the temperature, a method of determining heat that Andy thought had gone out with cassette tapes. The equipment on the walls and cheap Formica tables still had dials on them, for crying out loud. But it wasn't as if anybody needed to know the weather, especially here. It was the desert, it was dry, and it was hot. Once the platform settled in place, Andy started backpedaling toward the open door. The hazmat suit had its own temperature regulation, for which Andy was grateful, as the shift from the air-conditioned umbrella complex to the great outdoors of the California desert was a transition Andy wouldn't normally be eager to make. Stepping outside, Andy deliberately looked down at the sandy ground outside the weather station. He didn't want to see what lay beyond. He just wanted to dump the body and get back downstairs where it was safe. "On 3, Paul said before Andy could say anything. He added, "And if you ask me if it's 1, 2, 3 and then go, or go on 3, I will punch you." Realizing he was getting predictable in his old age, Andy just muttered, "People have no respect for the classics." "I respect the classics. I don't respect you beating them into the ground." Andy chuckled, grateful to the security guard for taking his mind off what they were doing and where they were doing it. In unison, the pair of them started to swing the body. "And a 1, Paul said, "and a 2, and a 3. On 3, they tossed the body to the left into the big trench. Without even thinking about it, Andy looked up. What he saw, as usual, made his most recent meal well up into the back of his throat, and he almost doubled over from the nausea. His immediate field of vision was the big trench into which they'd thrown Alice 85. The trench was lined with lime and filled with the remains of not only Alice 85, but of the previous 84 Alices as well. 84 identical red dress wearing corpses. Well, 82 really. The one that had been diced by the laser grid was just an undistinguished pile of meat chunks. And then there was Alice 9, who, for reasons no one had been able to figure out, just went crazy in the bathroom right after she woke up and dashed her brains out against the bathroom wall before she even got dressed. So her corpse had remained nude. That wasn't what made Andy want to lose his breakfast, however. He'd become inured to the multiple identical corpses. He suspected that if he ever met the real Alice Abernathy, ass-kicking Alice, as Paul referred to her, he'd expect her to wander around mutely until something killed her, too. No, it was what lay beyond the trench. The weather station was surrounded by a 15-foot-high perimeter fence that was topped with razor wire. Pushing against it were literally thousands of corpses that had been animated by the T-virus. Andy preferred to think of them as animated corpses. Calling them zombies just brought to mind bad horror movies and also made it hard to take them seriously. They all had learned the hard way to take these things seriously. Once the fence had been electrified, but that proved to be more trouble than it was worth. The corpses were constantly shambling right into the fence, which meant that the current was nearly constant and not doing any good. Electrified fences generally were meant as a deterrent rather than a physical means of restraint. The subject would be shocked once and know better than to try again. But animated corpses didn't even have as much reasoning ability as your average wild animal, and so, no matter how much you shocked them, they didn't die, being already dead, and didn't learn any better. So Isaacs killed the juice on the fence, as long as they couldn't get through, and they hadn't shown any signs of being able to do so yet, they were safe. "Where the hell did they come from?" Paul suddenly asked. Andy turned to look at him, which was a relief, since even his hazmat suit obscured features were an improvement on the hordes of corpses. "What do you mean? We're in the middle of the desert. What, these people wandered over from Vegas?" "Tell you what, Paul. I'll see if Isaacs wants to run a study of zombie migratory patterns, okay?" That got a laugh, and Paul said, "Come on, let's get back downstairs." "No problem," Andy said emphatically, turning back toward the weather station. "God, I just wish we could get the original back. Dumping clones is starting to get a little tiresome." "Fat chance," Paul said. "You don't know ass-kicking Alice. Isaacs couldn't keep her if he tried. In fact, he didn't try." "I thought he had her in Detroit." Paul smiled. "Not for long. He didn't even try to keep her in San Francisco." Andy shook his head as they re-entered the weather station and walked onto the platform. Paul stepped on the red button again. "I just don't see what we're accomplishing at this point. The results are always the same. Sure, she doesn't always die in the same spot in the labyrinth, but she always dies eventually, and the blood works all within expected norms." Paul shrugged. "As long as it keeps us safe down here instead of out there, I don't give a damn what the guys do." At that, Andy sighed. "Amen."